told you mother was in the ER, so send the money. My brother shouted over the phone, but I was already standing outside the same hospital he named, so I said, then come meet me by the front desk. And the nurse told me nobody by her name had checked in. The first time my brother called, I was in the middle of buying groceries after work, and I almost dropped my phone into the produce bin when I saw his name. That alone should have told me something was off. My brother never called me first unless he needed something, and even then it was usually after he had exhausted everybody else. When I answered, he sounded like he had been running. Not the kind of running where you were in shape and trying to keep a schedule. The kind where panic had already been going on for a while, and his breathing was more about fear than effort. He told me our mother had been rushed to the ER. He said she had collapsed, that the ambulance had taken her to St. Matthews, and that the hospital was refusing to admit her until someone paid a deposit because her insurance was acting up. He said the receptionist needed a card right away. He said it like there was no room for questions. I asked what happened. He did not answer cleanly. He said she had been weak all morning. Then he said she had chest pain. Then he said she was confused. Then he said the doctor wanted tests. The details kept changing just enough to sound urgent and just enough to keep me from catching anything solid. I remember standing there in the aisle with a cart full of milk, rice, and eggs, trying to decide whether my first instinct was disgust or fear. Our mother had health problems for years. Nothing dramatic enough to make her helpless, but enough that an ER trip was not impossible. She had high blood pressure. She got dizzy sometimes. She had one bad fall the year before that made all of us more careful whenever she complained about feeling off. So my brain did the thing brains do when they hear bad news about a parent. It started racing ahead to worst-case scenarios. I asked which hospital again. He repeated St. Matthews, then added the downtown one near the old bus terminal. That part mattered later because there were 2 St. Matthews in our city, and he was trying very hard to keep me from noticing he had chosen the one that was furthest from where our mother actually lived. At the time, I did not catch that. I only heard fear. He said he was with her in the waiting area, that they needed money for labs and a room, and that if I could send something right then, it would save time. He did not say how much at first. He waited until I said I was on my way. Then he asked for 20,000 pesos. I remember that number because it was stupidly specific for an emergency he supposedly barely understood. Not enough to cover some major procedure. Too much to be a random guess. Just enough to sound like he had already asked somebody else for something similar and was now rounding up from a script. I told him I would come to the hospital. He got sharper instantly. He said there was no time. He said they were already making a scene about the payment desk. He said if I loved Mom, I would just transfer it. That was the first sentence that really bothered me because my brother had always used guilt the way other people used punctuation. It was never just one point. It was always a whole paragraph of pressure. I asked him to put Mom on the phone. He said she was too weak. I asked him to send a picture of her wristband or the admission slip. He said they were not letting him take photos in the ER. I asked him for the exact name on the bill. He said the nurse would not stop him long enough to check. Everything about it felt rushed in the most convenient way possible. I told him I was leaving work, and I hung up before he could start again. On the drive downtown, I kept telling myself I was being paranoid. That brother or not, when somebody says your mother is in the ER, you do not sit around acting like a detective. You go. So I went. St. Matthews downtown sat on a corner that always smelled like traffic, disinfectant, and somebody's burnt coffee. I parked in a lot 2 blocks away because the hospital garage was full, and I walked faster than I wanted to admit. I was still halfway convinced I would get inside and feel stupid for doubting him. That possibility was embarrassing, but it was better than the other one. The other one was that he was lying about Mom being sick for money. At the front entrance, I stopped long enough to pull up my brother's last text. He had sent the hospital name and a partial room number that meant nothing. He had also sent a screenshot of a transfer request in a banking app. The screenshot looked rushed. That was the first thing I noticed. The second thing was that the account name on it was not our mother's. It was his. He had made the request from his own account and just typed Mom's name in the note. I did not understand why that mattered at first, but it sat in my head like a splinter. At the front desk, I told the clerk I was looking for my mother. I gave our mother's full name. The woman typed into the computer, looked up, then back down. She asked me to spell the surname. I did. She asked if I meant an inpatient or an emergency registration. I told her I did not know, that my brother had said the ER. She searched again. Then she asked me to have a seat for a minute. That was the moment my stomach started sinking. Not because she said anything bad, because she did not say the normal things a busy hospital staffer says when your parent is genuinely there. She did not tell me the ER was crowded. She did not say she needed a few minutes to pull the chart. She asked for the name again like she had already decided it was not going to turn up. I waited. I kept looking at the people moving through the lobby, thinking one of them might be my brother. He was not hard to spot in a crowd when he was stressed. He had a way of pacing like the floor had personally insulted him, but he was not there. The clerk came back a minute later with a polite face that made the news worse than if she had looked annoyed. She told me nobody by that name had checked in. No emergency registration. No inpatient admission. No overnight hold. Nothing under her name at either front desk system. I remember actually asking her if she was sure she had spelled it right. She let me give it again. Same result. I asked if there was another St. Matthews around here. She said yes, but this one did not have anybody matching that name in the last 24 hours. I walked out of that desk area with the kind of hot, humiliating confusion that makes your ears ring. Not because I had been lied to yet, at least not officially, but because there was now a real hospital employee, a computer screen, and my own mother's name all refusing to line up with my brother's story. I called him from the sidewalk. He picked up on the second ring. I told him I was at St. Matthews downtown. I told him the front desk said nobody by Mom's name was checked in. He did not answer for a full beat. Then he said I must have gone to the wrong desk. I said there was only one front desk. He said maybe they had not updated the chart yet. I said I had asked twice and he should come meet me by the front desk if he was really there. That was when he raised his voice. He shouted that I was making things harder. He shouted that Mom needed the money now. He shouted that I was acting like some kind of lawyer instead of a brother. People in the lobby turned to look. I hated that part more than I should have. I was standing there in my work clothes with a grocery bag cutting into my wrist while my grown brother yelled at me over the phone like I was the problem in a medical emergency. I told him again to meet me at the front desk. Then I asked him to hand the phone to Mom. That was the part that made him lose control. He said I was being disrespectful. He said I was wasting time. He said if she died, it would be on me. I did not respond right away because I heard something else in the background, not the noisy ER chaos he had described. Not the rolling stretchers and alarms and nurses talking over each other. I heard a television. I heard a child laughing. I heard the kind of ambient noise you get in a house where somebody is trying to act normal while on speakerphone. Not a hospital, definitely not a hospital. I asked him where he was. He said he was with Mom. I asked him again, slower. He said I was being a prick. That was when I hung up and called our mother directly. She answered on the third ring, cheerful and mildly annoyed in the way only mothers can be when they are not dying. She asked why I sounded out of breath. I asked where she was. She said at home. I asked if she was okay. She said she was fine, that she had been resting after going to the clinic earlier in the day for her blood pressure check. Then she asked why I was calling like somebody had died. I was standing on a public sidewalk outside a hospital while my pulse hammered in my ears. And I still remember that I laughed once in the stupidest possible way because the relief and anger hit at the same time. I asked her if my brother was with her. She said no. She said he had not been there all afternoon. She said he had called earlier asking about a possible bank transfer, but she had not agreed to anything. That was the first time I said out loud, to nobody in particular, that he had lied to me. I did not scream. I did not go back into the lobby and make a scene. I just stood there and kept asking my mother questions in a calmer voice than I felt. Was she hurt? No. Had she been admitted? No. Did she need anything? No. Had she asked him for money? Absolutely not. Had she heard from him since the clinic? Only one call where he sounded rushed and said he might need help paying for medicine. That was all. I asked if he had said why. She said he had not been specific. She said she thought maybe he was short on rent again. That told me two things at once. One, he was definitely lying. Two, he had probably used our mother's health to get access to me because he knew I was easier to guilt than I was to bully. I told Mom I would be by later. I did not explain everything yet because I still wanted to see how deep the lie went before I alarmed her. That was a mistake, though a small one. I should have told her right then. Instead, I walked back to my car and called my sister. She did not answer at first, so I texted her that I needed her to tell me whether our brother had called her too. She called back within a minute, and the first thing she said was that he had. That was how I learned this was not just about me. He had hit her up for $15,000 earlier that afternoon, saying Mom's tests were being held up. He had called our aunt as well. He had even texted one of our cousins in Manila who barely talked to him, asking for help with emergency costs. He had been working the family angle from every direction at once. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine off and listened to my sister get angrier and angrier as she realized I was not joking. She said she had almost sent him money. She said she had stopped only because the amount did not match what he had told her an hour earlier. She had already suspected something because he kept changing the story when people asked for specifics. At that point, I was no longer just suspicious. I was furious in a strange, controlled way that made me too quiet. The kind of anger where your brain starts cataloging details instead of exploding. I told her I was going to Mom's house. I told her to call our aunt and make sure nobody sent anything. Then I drove across town with the hospital parking lot still in my mirror and a very sharp feeling that I was about to find out my brother had not only lied, but had built the lie carefully enough to drag half the family into it. My mother lived in a small apartment on the second floor of a building she had rented for 12 years. She liked that place because it was near the market, the pharmacy, and the church she had stopped going to as often but still claimed as her own. When I arrived, she was in the kitchen with a glass of water and her blood pressure machine on the table. She looked healthy enough to make me feel ridiculous for even worrying. That did not last long, because my mother has a gift for noticing the exact emotional temperature in a room. The second she saw my face, she knew something was wrong. I asked her again if she was really okay. She said yes and then asked what my brother had done. That was when I told her everything, not all at once. I told it in pieces while pacing the kitchen and trying not to sound like I was accusing him before I had proof. I told her about the hospital. I told her about the front desk. I told her he had shouted at me to send money. I told her his story changed every time I asked for detail. By the time I finished, she had gone very still. That stillness scared me more than tears would have. She sat down slowly and asked whether he had actually said she was in the ER. I said yes. She put both hands over her face and stayed that way for a long time. When she finally spoke, she said he had been acting strange for weeks. Not openly. Just enough little things. Missing calls, requests for cash at odd hours, a sudden interest in knowing what bills she was paying and when. She said he had come over twice offering to help organize her paperwork. At the time, she had thought he was finally being responsible. Now she was not so sure. I asked if he had ever had access to her banking app. She looked up at me very slowly. That was the wrong question. I could tell before she answered. She said he had helped her set up the app after her phone had been replaced 2 months earlier. That alone did not prove anything, but it made the shape of the problem much worse. I asked to see her phone. There was a message thread from him asking her to confirm the last 4 digits of her debit card because the pharmacy system had glitched. There were also 2 bank transfer requests from his account to hers, both canceled. One had a note about medication. The other said transport. Neither made sense. My stomach turned when I noticed the timestamps. They were sent after he had already called me. That meant the hospital story was not his first move. It was his backup. I asked whether she had ever approved any transfer. She said no. She had ignored them because she was still waiting for her pension deposit and did not like the tone of the messages. My brother had apparently decided she was too slow to scam directly, so he had moved on to the siblings. I went home that night with a folder in my backpack full of screenshots, bank notifications, and the kind of ugly mental arithmetic that comes from trying to figure out whether a person you grew up with is just irresponsible or something much worse. I did not sleep much. I kept going through every conversation I had had with him in the last few months. The rent problem, the car repairs, the medicine his girlfriend supposedly needed, the temporary loans that never seemed temporary. It was always one more thing. Always urgent, always inconveniently timed right after payday. I had helped him more than I wanted to admit, not because I trusted him completely, but because I had told myself family meant something, and because I had not wanted to be the kind of brother who let another brother drown over pride. Now I was starting to see that he had been counting on exactly that. The next morning, I called the bank to ask about the transfer requests on my mother's account. I did not have her every detail yet, but with her permission, I had enough to discuss suspicious activity. That call changed the whole thing from family drama into something official. The banker was polite but direct. He confirmed that there had been repeated attempts to move money from our mother's account to my brother's. They had not gone through because of a newly enabled verification step. My mother had not remembered enabling it. I did, because I had helped her set up the new phone after the old one died, and I remembered the bank app asking if she wanted extra confirmation for new payees. She had tapped yes without understanding the long-term benefit. That tiny, boring decision was probably the only reason the money was still there. The banker also told me there had been login attempts from an unfamiliar device. Not enough to say whether the account had been accessed, but enough to raise a flag. They advised us to change the password, lock the digital transfers, and come in to review recent activity. That afternoon, I took my mother to the branch. She was embarrassed all the way there. Not angry at him yet in the dramatic sense. Just deeply, tiredly embarrassed. That was the hardest part. She kept saying she had tried to raise good sons and somehow still ended up in a branch office checking whether one of them had been stealing from her. I told her she had not failed at anything. He had. That did not make her feel better right away, but I meant it. At the branch, the employee printed a stack of transaction history and flagged the transfer attempts with red notes. The numbers were small enough that they looked almost pathetic once they were in front of us. That was when the emotional scale of the lie started to make sense. He had not been plotting some giant theft. He had been scraping money from every relative he could reach, probably to cover one disaster after another, and using our mother as the most effective lever. Small lies, repeated often. The kind that turn into a real problem because each one gets easier. My sister met us at the bank, and the three of us sat there in a silent triangle while my mother stared at the paper, and my sister kept rubbing her temple. No one wanted to be the first to say what we were all thinking, so I did. I said he had probably spent the morning calling people and inventing the hospital story after his earlier requests were not enough. I said he had used the ER because nobody was going to hesitate if they thought Mom might be dying. My sister said she hated that she had almost fallen for it. I told her I almost did too. That was true, and I think it mattered that I admitted it. I was not smarter than the scam. I had just gotten to the hospital before I got soft enough to send the transfer. The branch manager told us there was a way to add an alert requiring in-person approval for large transfers and a note on the account about suspected family fraud. The phrase sounded cold, but it was useful. My mother signed the paperwork with a hand that shook a little. Then she asked the employee whether this meant she was overreacting. The poor woman looked uncomfortable, but she answered honestly and said no. She said it was better to be cautious, especially with family. That phrase stuck with me because she said it like she had seen this exact thing before. A few days later, my brother showed up at our mother's apartment like nothing had happened. He was sweaty, irritated, and carrying a grocery bag as if that alone might buy him forgiveness. He clearly had no idea we had compared notes. I was there. My sister was there too. He walked in and started talking before anyone could stop him. He said the hospital had been a mess. He said there had been a mix-up. He said he had tried to call me back. He said he had eventually gotten Mom checked out somewhere else. Every sentence came with a new piece of nonsense. My mother let him keep going for maybe 20 seconds. Then she asked him which hospital had supposedly seen her. He gave the downtown one. She asked him which doctor. He gave a name that was obviously invented because it sounded vaguely professional but not memorable. She asked him why the bank had flagged his transfer requests. He froze, not fully, just enough. His face had this ugly shift where he realized the room had more information than he thought. He looked at me, then at my sister, and then at the papers on the table. That was the first moment I saw real fear in him. Not fear for Mom. Fear that the game was already over and he had not been told. He tried to recover by acting offended. He said he could not believe we were interrogating him during a family emergency. That would probably have worked on me a year earlier. This time it just made him look tired and stupid. My mother asked him whether she had ever been admitted to the ER that day. He said yes with too much force. She asked him to name the nurse who had admitted her. He could not. She asked him to describe the waiting area. He started talking about the wrong hospital wing. My sister laughed once, but it was a bitter sound. He finally looked at me and said I had set him up. That one almost made me laugh too, except I was too angry. I told him I had done nothing except go to the hospital he named. Then I told him the front desk had no record of her at all. The silence after that was enormous. He still tried one more angle. He said maybe the hospital had made an error. I said the bank had not made an error when it flagged his repeated transfer attempts. I said Mom had not made an error when she said he never asked her for permission. Then I asked him why his account name was on every request. That was the question he could not survive. He stood there blinking like I had pulled the floor out from under him. Then he did what people like him always do when cornered. He got mad that we had found out instead of apologizing that he had done it. He said we were ganging up on him. He said Mom always favored me because I was stable. He said my sister only cared because I made her suspicious. He said he was trying to help the family and nobody appreciated how hard it was for him. That word help sounded wrong coming out of him, not because he had never helped anyone. He had, but because he used it like camouflage. Like if he could say the word fast enough, nobody would look at the pile of receipts behind it. My mother told him to leave. He refused at first. He said he had nowhere to go. That was maybe the first genuinely true thing he said all week, but truth did not make him innocent. My sister stood up and told him to sit down and listen for once in his life. That shocked me more than anything. She was not a dramatic person, but she had reached the point where her voice had gone sharp enough to cut him. She said we knew about the rent debt. We knew about the loans from his coworkers. We knew about the late notices on the car he had been pretending was fine. She said if he needed help, he should have asked like a human being instead of lying about our mother being in the ER. His face changed again when she mentioned the car. That was when I understood there was more, much more. After he left, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the cabinet hinges, I asked her what she meant about the car. She looked at me and said our brother had taken out a loan on his vehicle without telling anybody. Not a formal family loan, a high-interest one through some app-based lender. He had been missing payments for months. The car was at risk of repossession. He had apparently been hiding that and using emergency stories to cover the shortfall. That explained a lot. Suddenly, the hospital lie was not some isolated act of cruelty. It was a bridge over a hole that kept getting deeper. The next week was a blur of practical mess. My mother changed every password she had. She went to the bank in person. She removed my brother as the backup contact on her account. My sister helped her make a paper folder with printed statements, a list of approved helpers, and the number of the branch manager. I filed screenshots of his texts in case anyone later tried to claim he had been misunderstood. I also started going through my own history with him and found a depressing number of small transfers I had forgotten about. 20 here, 50 there. A borrowed amount for groceries that somehow turned into a borrowed amount for fuel, and then a borrowed amount for a medical thing that he never specified. None of it was enough to make a police report on its own. Together, it looked like a pattern. I asked a lawyer friend whether keeping records like that would matter if this got ugly. He told me yes, absolutely. He also told me not to threaten anything I was not willing to follow through on. That advice mattered later. My brother kept calling. At first, he called everyone separately. Then he switched to group texts trying to make himself sound calmer than he was. He said people were misunderstanding him. He said he had only borrowed money because he was in between jobs and under pressure. He said nobody understood how hard it was to be the one trying to keep things moving. There was never an apology in any of it. Not a real one. Just explanations for why everyone else should lower their standards until he found solid ground again. My mother finally responded to one of his texts with a simple message, saying she was no longer willing to send money or serve as a backup for his debts. He replied with a paragraph about how she was choosing sides. That sentence did more damage to my opinion of him than the hospital lie, honestly. Because after everything, he still believed the story was about loyalty to him, not honesty, not fear, not trust. The story in his head was about whether we would keep enabling him. There was a family dinner 2 Sundays later that still makes me tired to think about. My aunt insisted we all come because she believed family meals could clear the air. She meant well. Sometimes people who mean well create the worst possible rooms. My brother showed up late and acted normal for about 5 minutes. Then my mother asked him if he had anything to say. He did not, or maybe he did and chose not to. Instead, he said he had already apologized for causing stress. That was a lie. He had never apologized for the lie itself, only for the stress surrounding it. My aunt, who had been living in a world where people still used shame as a moral compass, asked him directly why he would make up an ER visit. He stared at his plate for a long time before saying he had panicked. That was the most honest thing he had said. I almost believed that part. Panic can make people do stupid things. I had enough experience with real panic to know that. But panic does not require a fake hospital name. Panic does not require a bank transfer to your own account. Panic does not require calling half the family with the same story and changing the details each time. Panic might explain the first call. It did not explain the structure around it. My aunt then did something I did not expect. She asked him whether the car loan was true. He looked at her like she had slapped him. That was when I realized one of our relatives had already talked. She had been quiet the whole week, but apparently not blind. He tried to dodge. She kept asking. Finally, he admitted to the car loan, not the full amount, not the lender. Just enough to admit he had been hiding another problem while asking for hospital money. That was the moment the dinner went dead. Not angry dead. Worse, disappointed dead. I have never seen a room sober up faster than when everyone in it realizes somebody has been lying for so long that the lies are now serving each other. After dinner, my aunt pulled my mother aside and offered to help with appointments if she needed it. My mother said she appreciated that but wanted to handle things through the bank and the clinic from now on. That answer hurt my brother more than if she had screamed at him, because it meant she had moved from emotional betrayal to administrative distance. That is a terrible place to be as a child, even an adult child. A week after that, the lender on his car sent a notice to our mother's apartment by mistake because he had listed her old address as a reference contact. I opened the envelope because my mother was at church. The notice was ugly in the plainest possible way. Late payments, final warning, possible repossession, and buried in the fine print, a reference to a co-signer we had never heard about. That part interested me. I started asking questions. Carefully at first because I did not want to pry into his entire life out of spite. Then less carefully because once you see the corners of a lie, you start checking every edge. It turned out he had not just used our mother's name in emergencies. He had been using her address for more than one application. When I compared the loan notice with his messages, I realized the hospital deposit language matched the kind of language shady lenders and debt apps used to make people panic. He had likely built a whole personal finance disaster out of borrowed time and borrowed sympathy. He had probably thought the family story would buy him a few days. Instead, it exposed everything. At that point, I had enough documentation to go formal if I needed to. I had the hospital verification, the bank statements, the screenshots, the loan notice, the canceled transfer requests, the family text threads. I did not know whether I would need any of it, but I kept it in a folder anyway. My brother noticed the shift before he said anything about it. That was another pattern with him. He could always sense when he was losing control, but he never knew exactly how. He stopped by my place one evening after work and asked to talk. He looked exhausted enough that for a second I felt almost sorry for him. Almost. He said he had messed up. He said he had been under a lot of pressure. He said he had not meant to drag Mom into it. That was the closest thing to an apology I got for a long time. Then he asked if I would help him by covering one more payment. I remember standing in my doorway looking at him and feeling the strange emotional exhaustion that comes from being asked to forgive a problem while the problem is still standing in front of you. I told him no, not loudly, just no. He tried to argue that if I did not help, the loan company might take his car and then he would lose his job. That sounded like a real consequence, and maybe it was. I told him I was sorry about the car, but I was not paying for a lie he had built on our mother's health. He said I was being cold. I said I was being done. That made him angry, not explosive angry, more like offended angry, which in some ways was worse because it showed how deeply he still expected the family to absorb everything. He said if the car went, it would be my fault too because I had humiliated him. That was the line where I stopped feeling guilty entirely. I told him the hospital had not humiliated him. He had humiliated himself by inventing a medical emergency to shake money out of his family. Then I handed him a printed list of the transfer attempts and told him to keep it if he wanted to remember how many chances he had burned. He left without saying goodbye. For the first time in our adult lives, I did not call after him. A month later, the bank contacted my mother about another attempted transfer from an unfamiliar device. This one had been blocked completely. The account was locked down now, so the attempt did not go anywhere. But the report showed the login time and the location data. It matched my brother's apartment building. That was enough. My mother filed a fraud complaint with the bank and changed the remaining account permissions. The bank told her they could not prove his identity as the person behind the login without more evidence, but the internal record would help if anything else happened. That led to a police report, though not in the dramatic way people imagine. No handcuffs, no shouting in a hallway, just my mother sitting in a chair with a bored but competent officer, while she explained that a family member had tried to access her account without permission. The officer took copies of the documents and suggested she monitor everything closely. He also told us very plainly that what my brother had done was not a harmless family misunderstanding. It was the kind of thing that can grow into real financial abuse if nobody stops it. That phrase hit my mother harder than I expected. Financial abuse. She cried in the car on the way home, quietly, with her hand over her mouth like she was ashamed of the tears. I pulled over in a gas station lot and just let her sit there for a minute. I think she was grieving two things at once. One was the lie, the other was the version of her son she had wanted to believe in. After that, the family changed, not all at once, more like furniture being moved in a room after a breakup. People avoided certain topics. People stopped answering his calls as fast. My aunt became the unofficial checkpoint for any request involving money. My sister put him on a strict information diet. My mother still loved him, but now it was the exhausted kind of love that stays alive while refusing to be touched. As for me, I did not cut him off entirely. I know that sounds generous, but it was more practical than noble. He was still my brother. I answered if he called with something real. I listened if he said he needed work advice or help finding a cheaper mechanic or a lead on an apartment, but I did not send money. Not a peso. I did not let him borrow my name, my account, or my patience. That turned out to be enough to make him alternate between anger and fake reconciliation for a while. He would be quiet for weeks, then send some half-dramatic message about how families were supposed to help each other. I always replied with the same thing in different words. I would help him make a plan. I would not rescue him from consequences. That phrase irritated him more than any insult could have. About 6 months after the hospital lie, the debt caught up with him. The car was repossessed. His landlord served him a notice because he had missed rent after using his move-in deposit on the loan payments. He called our mother in a panic, not to ask for money this time, but to ask whether she knew of any place with cheaper rent and whether she could talk to the landlord on his behalf. She told him no, not because she hated him, because she had finally understood that every time she stepped in, she became part of the system keeping him from learning. That was hard for her. She had always been the kind of mother who tried to absorb pain before it reached her children. Now she was learning that some pain is the lesson. He ended up staying with a friend for a while and then moving into a room he could barely afford on the edge of the city. He complained about it to me once, and I almost laughed because the new place sounded exactly like what someone gets when they spend a year treating emergency calls as a financial strategy. He asked whether I really thought he had planned the hospital story. I told him I thought he had planned enough of it to know it was a lie. He did not argue. That was maybe the only time I saw him fully understand that I knew, not just suspected. Knew. What changed the most, though, was my mother. Not in a tragic way, in a stronger one. She started checking her bank app every morning like a routine instead of a fear response. She kept a paper record of every appointment and payment. She even started asking the bank employee questions she used to be embarrassed to ask. That part made me proud of her in a way I could not say easily. She did not become suspicious of everyone. She just stopped assuming family meant safe. That was the lesson, I think. Not that people are evil. Just that closeness does not replace proof. A year later, when my mother had a real ER visit for a blood pressure spike, the irony hit all of us at once. She called me herself from the clinic first because she had learned to be specific. She told me her symptoms. She told me which hospital they were sending her to. She told me the doctor's name. She told me not to panic because it was being handled. I got there within 20 minutes anyway, but this time the front desk knew exactly who she was. This time there was a real registration. This time the paperwork matched the story. My brother showed up later, awkward and quiet, and stayed by the wall while the doctor explained the treatment plan. He did not ask for anything. He did not volunteer advice. He just stood there like a man who had finally learned there are some lies you can tell once and never fully outrun. The hospital visit itself was not dramatic. She got fluids. Her medication was adjusted. We took her home the same night. But I remember looking at the discharge papers and feeling this odd, clean kind of relief. Not because everything was fixed, it was not, but because the one person who had tried to weaponize her health had lost the ability to control the story. Everyone in that room knew the truth now. No one was being rushed. No one was being manipulated. No one was asking me to send money while standing in a place that did not exist. I still think about that call sometimes. Mostly because it taught me how fast guilt can outrun common sense when family is involved. It also taught me something less dramatic and more useful. Calm is not the same thing as passivity. I did not win because I was louder than my brother. I won because I went to the hospital, I asked for the records, I called my mother, I kept the screenshots, I checked the bank. I followed the paper trail all the way until the lie had nowhere left to sit. That was all, no revenge, no big speech, just facts in order outlasting panic. My brother and I are not close now. We are polite at family events. That is probably as good as it gets. My mother still loves him, but she loves him with boundaries attached, which is something she never had before and probably should have had years ago. Sometimes I think about how easy it would have been to send the money that day. 20,000 pesos was not nothing, but it also was not life-changing for me. If I had sent it, the family probably would have never asked enough questions. He would have gotten away with that version of the lie and moved on to the next one. Instead, he got caught because I happened to be outside the same hospital he named. That part was luck. Everything after that was not. Everything after that was paperwork, patience, and the uncomfortable decision to trust what was verifiable over what sounded urgent. It cost us a lot of peace for a while. It also probably saved my mother from losing money she could not easily replace. And maybe more important, it forced my brother to confront the fact that at some point, being under pressure stops being an excuse and starts being a pattern. I did not get a dramatic apology. I did not get a tearful confession with music swelling in the background. What I got was quieter and more real than that. I got a mother who stopped apologizing for protecting herself. I got a sister who learned to say no without feeling guilty. I got a bank account that no longer belongs to family politics. And I got a brother who finally understands that if he calls me screaming about an emergency, I am going to check the facts before I believe the story. That was enough. It still is.